The land office in Canyon Ford had 2 windows and 1 door. And on the last cold morning of September in the year 1887, all 3 were being watched by 6 armed men on horseback, while a thin, balding clerk named Elias Whitcomb threw the bolt on that single door with hands that trembled so badly, he dropped the key twice before it caught. "Whitcomb," called the rider at the front, a broad man with a drooping mustache and a Winchester laid easy across his saddle bow. "Mr. Kroll wants that record book, the one with the crossing deed. You open this door or we open it for you." "That book belongs to the territory," Whitcomb answered through the wood, his voice cracking on the last word. "I will not hand over a legal record to men waving rifles at me." "Then we will take it," the rider said, and nodded to the man beside him, who swung down with a felling axe borrowed from someone's woodpile. It was at that moment that Albert Hadley came around the corner of the Mercantile with a coil of rope over one shoulder, on his way to string a new gate hinge for the livery, and stopped cold at the sight of 6 horses and an axe raised against a door with a frightened old man standing behind it. "That is a strange way to request a look at public paperwork," Albert said, loud enough to carry but not shouting, the way a man speaks when he wants to be heard without being mistaken for afraid. The rider with the mustache, whose name was Silas Rourke, turned his horse half around. "This is not your business, Hadley." "Might be," Albert said, setting the rope down slow, showing his hands were empty of anything but rope fiber. "I have got a deed filed in there myself. Bakery lot, the burned one, corner of Canyon Road and the ferry track. If that book goes missing, so does my claim, and I would take that personal." It was the first time in 3 years that Albert Hadley had said his own claim out loud in front of witnesses, and it landed heavier in the cold air than he expected, because it was also the first time the town of Canyon Ford heard that the quiet blacksmith who mended their wagon wheels and shod their horses had filed paper on Josephine Aldridge's burned bakery lot at all. Rourke's eyes narrowed on him with the particular attention of a man doing arithmetic in his head, counting years and faces, and something in that look made the hair rise on the back of Albert's neck, though he did not let it show. "Funny thing," Rourke said slowly, "a man with no family and no property in this county filing paper on a widow's ground." "Not so funny," Albert said, "just neighborly." Rourke held his gaze a long moment, then looked past him to the gathering crowd, for a crowd was gathering now, drawn by raised voices the way any small canyon town is drawn to trouble, men in shirt sleeves and women with flour still on their aprons, and the schoolboy who ran errands for the assay office, all of them staring at 6 armed riders in front of the land office at 9 in the morning. Rourke seemed to weigh the arithmetic of an audience against the arithmetic of an axe, and decided against the axe. "We will be back," he said to Whitcomb, to Albert, to the town in general, and he turned his horse and led his 5 men off down the road toward the toll bridge, their departure unhurried, which was somehow worse than if they had fled. Whitcomb opened the door only after the last hoofbeat faded, and he looked at Albert with an expression somewhere between gratitude and a new, careful curiosity. "You did not have to do that, Mr. Hadley." "No," Albert agreed. "I did not." Josephine Aldridge had come out from the ruin of her bakery 2 doors down, still in her apron, though there was no oven behind it anymore, only a black square of fallen timber, an ash that the frost had been silvering every morning for 3 weeks now. She stood at the edge of the crowd with flour on her hands from kneading dough over at Mrs. Petrie's borrowed kitchen, and she watched Albert Hadley pick his coil of rope back up off the ground as though nothing at all had happened, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the fire loosened by one single notch. She had known Albert Hadley 3 years, in the way a small canyon town lets people know each other, by nod and by trade and by the small kindnesses exchanged over a counter. She had not known until that morning that he had filed a claim on her lot. She crossed the road to him while Whitcomb ushered the last of the gawkers back to their business. "Mr. Hadley," she said, "you filed on my land. Albert's ears went red beneath his hat brim, which she found unaccountably endearing. "It was not to take it from you, Mrs. Aldridge. Whitcomb told me 2 weeks back that if the lot sat unclaimed through the winter on account of the fire, the county might list it as abandoned come spring, on account of your husband's name still being the one on the old paper and no widow's filing since. I did not want to trouble you with it until I was sure it would hold. I filed a builder's claim alongside yours, is all, so there would be 2 names on the record instead of 1, and harder for anybody to argue the ground was empty." Josephine studied him. He was a tall man, sun-browned, with the kind of quiet stillness that came, she had always assumed, from being a blacksmith and having to hold steady over fire and iron for hours at a stretch. She had never once heard him raise his voice, and she had never once seen him back down, and she found she did not entirely know what to make of a man who could hold both those things at the same time. "2 names," she repeated. "Yours and mine." "Yes, ma'am." "That is a strange gift to give a widow you have exchanged perhaps 40 words with in 3 years, Mr. Hadley." "I have always found," Albert said, looking somewhere over her shoulder at the black ruin of her bakery, "that a man ought to spend his standing on something worth losing it for." She did not have an answer for that. She only nodded once and went back to Mrs. Petrie's kitchen with her heart beating strangely in her hands when she looked down at them, still dusted white with flour that was not, at that moment, her own. Canyon Ford sat where the Uncompahgre country folded itself into a red-walled gorge deep enough to swallow the sun by 4 in the afternoon come October, and the only ways across that gorge were the toll bridge that Jasper Kroll's company had built 4 years back, charging 50 cents a wagon and a dime a rider, and the old rope ferry a half-mile downstream that had been there since before the town had a name, run by a leathery old Ute-descended waterman named Perkins, who charged nothing at all, on principle, and had been trying to keep the ferry running on goodwill and driftwood repairs ever since Kroll's bridge went up and began strangling his trade. Whoever controlled both crossings controlled who could bring flour and lumber and mail into Canyon Ford, and who could carry ore and cattle and letters out. And Jasper Kroll understood this better than any man in the territory, which was why he wanted the ferry landing shut, and why he wanted the lot at the mouth of Canyon Road, the lot that held the ashes of Josephine Aldridge's bakery. Because that lot held the only level ground wide enough to build an approach road that would let his bridge take freight wagons instead of just riders and light buggies. With that lot, Kroll's bridge became the only practical crossing in the canyon. Without it, Perkins' free ferry stayed a real alternative, and men who did not want to pay Kroll's toll would keep using it. Josephine's late husband, Thomas Aldridge, had understood a piece of this too. 2 years passed. In the autumn of '85, he had gone down to the bridge at dusk to look at a cracked support timber he did not trust, wanting to warn the town before a loaded ore wagon crossed it, and the timber had given way beneath his own boots instead, and the gorge had taken him before anyone could throw a rope. Kroll's company had called it an accident of poor construction, paid Josephine $40 in what they termed compensation, and gone on charging tolls the following week as though nothing at all had happened. Josephine had taken the $40 because she needed it, and had hated herself a little for taking it, and had baked bread every single morning since with a grief in her that never entirely left her hands, though her bread, everyone agreed, had only grown better for it, as though sorrow, needed long enough, could turn sweet. She had also, in the 2 years since, begun teaching. There was no schoolhouse in Canyon Ford, only a scatter of children who could not read a seed catalog or figure a fair price at the mercantile, and Josephine had begun keeping them an hour after the bakery closed, teaching letters and sums at the long table by lamplight, until the town council, led by a dry, careful man named Horace Bidwell, who ran the mercantile, and did not care to see a widow setting herself up as an authority without a husband or a board behind her, had told her she required a proper license and a proper room and proper oversight before she could call it a school at all, and had tabled the matter twice, and would likely table it a third time if given the chance, because tabling things cost nothing and required no one to be the man who told a grieving widow no to her face. Josephine thought this was a particular kind of injustice, the kind that wore the friendly face of caution, and she said so plainly whenever asked, which was not often, because most people preferred not to ask her plain questions and receive plain answers. This was the woman Albert Hadley watched, 3 weeks after the fire, wondering how a person carried that much and still stood so straight. He came to her 2 nights after the business at the land office after dark, when the forge was cool and his day's work done, and found her sitting on an overturned nail keg in the ruin of her own bakery, looking at nothing in particular by the light of a single lantern. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, from a respectful distance, "you are letting the cold in on yourself, sitting out here past sundown." "I am letting myself sit in my own kitchen," she said, "without heat, which is a thing I used to do every night of my married life, and I find I am not ready to give it up simply because the walls are gone." He came a little closer, turning his hat in his hands, an old habit when he had something difficult to say. "I have been thinking on your lot, Mrs. Aldridge, and I would like your permission to rebuild it." She looked up at him properly then, the lantern light catching the gray of her eyes. "Rebuild it? With what, Mr. Hadley?" "I have $40 from Kroll's company, most of it spent on flour I bake in Mrs. Petrie's oven, and no bank in this canyon will lend a widow money against a burned lot with a disputed deed." "I have some savings," Albert said, which was not, strictly speaking, a lie, though it was not the whole truth either, since his savings at that moment amounted to $11 and a horse. "Some savings will not buy lumber for a bakery, Mr. Hadley." "No," he admitted. "But I have a horse worth $80 if he is worth a nickel, and a saddle a horse trader in Ridgway has been trying to buy off me for 2 years, and I have got 2 good hands and no wife or children needing feeding, and I have got 3 years in this town of watching you feed half the children in it whether their fathers could pay you or not. I would like to spend what I have on something that will still be standing after I am gone, and I cannot think of anything better to spend it on than your oven." Josephine felt something rise in her throat that she did not immediately have a name for. She had been offered charity before, in the careful, pitying way that made her want to throw it back in the giver's face, and this was not that. This was a man offering to spend himself, plainly, the way he had spoken of it at the land office 2 days before, and there was no pity in his voice at all, only a kind of stubborn, quiet certainty that made refusing him feel almost like an insult to his intelligence. "I cannot ask that of you," she said anyway, because it seemed the proper thing to say. "You are not asking it," Albert said. "I am telling you I am going to do it. You are only being asked whether you will let me build the oven where you want it, or whether I ought to guess." She laughed then, surprising herself, a short startled sound in the cold dark, and it was the first time she had laughed since the fire, and Albert Hadley heard it and thought that he would gladly spend every dollar he ever earned again to hear it a second time. He rode out 3 days later before first light, on the sorrel gelding he had called Ranger for 5 years, the one good horse and the one good saddle that had come with him out of a life he did not speak of to anyone in Canyon Ford, and he did not tell Josephine where he was going, only that he had business in Ridgway and would be back within the week with lumber and nails arranged. The truth was more complicated than lumber. Albert Hadley had once, a lifetime ago it felt, ridden with men who took what they wanted at the point of a gun, and though he had never fired the shot that killed rancher Henry Colby during a robbery gone wrong outside Telluride 9 years past, he had been there, young and desperate, and following a man named Big Tom Dawson, whose gang he had fallen in with after his own family's ranch failed. And he had ridden away from that robbery with his share of the money and a weight in his chest that had never once lifted since. He had left the gang within the year, changed nothing about his name because Albert Hadley was the only name he had ever truly owned, only shed the false trail name Cole he had used while riding, and had spent the years since trying to become a man his own conscience could live beside. Part of that had meant finding Henry Colby's widow, a woman named Ruth Colby who ran a small dairy outside Telluride, and sending her $10 a month every month without ever telling her who sent it or why, only signing the envelopes with no name at all, because he did not believe an apology from the man responsible would ease her grief, only remind her of it. That was where his savings went every month, and had gone for 3 years in Canyon Ford, which was why a blacksmith with steady work and no family had $11 to his name in the autumn of '87. So he rode to Ridgway not merely for lumber, but to see a horse trader named Otis Yancey who had wanted Ranger and the tooled saddle for 2 years, and he sold both for $85, more than he had expected, because Yancey had genuinely coveted that saddle. And he walked back out of Yancey's stable that afternoon feeling the strange, light unbalance of a man who has just sold the last thing that ever truly belonged to him. And then he went and bought lumber, nails, glass for 2 windows, and an oven grate ordered special from the foundry. And with the money running thinner than he liked, he went to see a freight hauler named Jim Turley, who had ridden with the same gang once, years before, and had gone as straight as Albert had, running an honest freight line now out of Ridgway. "Cole," Turley said, using the old name out of habit before catching himself. "Albert. Good God, man, it has been years. I need flour, Jim, 200 pounds, maybe more if you can spare it, and I have not got the money left to pay full freight price for it." Turley looked at him a long moment, then laughed, not unkindly. "You are building something for somebody. I am. A woman." Albert did not answer that directly, which told Turley everything he needed to know. And Turley, who owed his own honest life partly to Albert having pulled him out of a burning line shack during their gang years without asking for thanks, said, "I have got flour coming down from the mill at Montrose I have not sold yet. I will let you have it at cost, and you can settle the difference with me in horseshoes and wagon repair whenever you are able. Only I will ask you one thing, Albert. Name it. Do not tell her where it came from. A woman worth building for does not need to know her bread started with men like us." Albert had thought about that request the whole ride back down out of the high country, 2 days of cold nights and warm noons, frost silvering the aspen leaves each morning and burning off by 10, the particular uncertain weather of a mountain autumn that could not decide if it belonged to summer or to winter yet. And he had decided Turley was right, though not entirely for Turley's reasons. He did not want Josephine to look at her flour and think of outlaws and dead ranchers and a debt 9 years old that would never fully be paid. He wanted her to look at her flour and think of bread, only bread, warm and rising and entirely her own. When the freight wagon rolled into Canyon Ford 4 days later with lumber, glass, an oven grate, and 240 pounds of good milled flour in canvas sacks, and Albert unloaded it all onto the burned lot before dawn while the town still slept, Josephine came out to find it stacked neat under a canvas tarp against the morning frost, and she stood there in her wrapper with her breath fogging in the cold air, staring at more flour than she had seen in one place since her wedding. And when Albert came around the corner of the Mercantile a few minutes later, feigning surprise at her being out so early, she rounded on him with her hands on her hips. "Where did this come from, Mr. Hadley?" "I know a man," Albert said. "That is not an answer." "It is the only one I have got today, Mrs. Aldridge." And he smiled at her in a way that made arguing feel suddenly like too much effort for a cold morning, and she let it go, though she did not forget it, filing the question away the way she filed away flour for later use. The rebuilding took the better part of 6 weeks, through October and into the first cold snaps of November, and it became, without either of them quite planning it, the center of Josephine Aldridge's days. She would rise before dawn to bake in Mrs. Petrie's borrowed kitchen, sell bread from a plank table set up on the ashes of her old porch, and spend the rest of the daylight hours handing Albert nails, holding boards steady while he sawed, learning the particular geometry of a building going up board by board. Albert taught her to drive a nail true without splitting the grain, and she taught him, in turn, to tell a proper sourdough starter by smell, and there developed between them the easy, comfortable intimacy of two people working with their hands side by side, an intimacy built less on words than on the small, unconscious moments of it, his hand steadying hers on a hammer, her fingers brushing flour from his sleeve. The two of them standing shoulder to shoulder at dusk, looking at a day's work, and saying nothing at all because nothing needed saying. "You have got sawdust in your hair," she told him once, reaching up before she quite thought about what she was doing, and her fingers in his hair made them both go still for a moment too long, and then she stepped back, flustered, and he cleared his throat and said something about the light going, and they did not speak of it, though neither of them forgot it either. The town noticed, of course. Canyon Ford was small enough that little escaped notice, and there was talk, some of it kind, wondering aloud when the blacksmith and the widow would simply admit what everyone could see plain as daylight, and some of it less kind, from men loyal to Kroll's Bridge Company who muttered that Hadley was courting trouble along with the widow, putting himself square in the way of men who did not care for interference. Horace Bidwell, for his part, used the rebuilding as fresh ammunition against Josephine's schooling ambitions. "A woman building a business and a school both," he said at a council meeting Josephine was not invited to but heard about within the hour, as one always does in a small town, with a man who is not her husband hammering nails at her lot from dawn to dusk. It does not paint the picture of a stable household we ought to entrust with the town's children. Josephine, when she heard this, went straight to the council meeting the following week uninvited, walked in with flour still on her apron, because she had come directly from the ovens, and said, "Mr. Bidwell, I would remind you that the children of this town cannot read their own names, and that a lack of stable households has never once stopped a boy from needing his letters. I have taught 19 children to read and figure in the evenings past 2 years without pay, without a schoolhouse, and without a single one of you offering so much as a lamp's worth of oil, and I will keep doing it whether this council licenses me or not. I only ask that you stop pretending your objection is about propriety when it is plainly about who holds the authority in this town, and whether a widow is allowed to hold any part of it herself." There was a long silence in the room, and then, unexpectedly, the Reverend, a soft-spoken man named Amos Greer who had said little in these debates before, cleared his throat and said, "Mrs. Aldridge has a point, Horace. My own boy can read a hymnal on account of her evenings when he could not before. I do not see the harm in licensing what is plainly already good work." The council did not vote that night, tabling the matter a third time as Josephine had predicted, but something had shifted in the room, and she walked out with her chin high, and did not notice until she reached the road that Albert Hadley had been standing at the back of the room the whole time, having come in quietly after her, and he fell into step beside her without a word, and after a moment he said, "I have never in my life seen a woman argue a room into silence like that." It did not change any votes. "No," he agreed, "but it changed the room. Votes follow eventually. I have found that out myself this month." She glanced sideways at him, at the set of his jaw in the moonlight, and thought, not for the first time, that there was a great deal more to Albert Hadley than a man who mended wagon wheels, and she found she wanted, very badly, to know what it was. She got her first real hint of it 2 weeks later, on an evening when Silas Rourke rode into town alone at dusk, and found Albert at the forge banking the fire for the night, and said, without preamble, "I know you, Hadley." Albert did not look up from the coals. "Most everyone in this town knows me, Rourke. 3 years will do that. Not what I mean. I rode bounty work down in the San Juans, 82, 83. There was a poster out on a gang running with Big Tom Dawson. One of the riders went by coal. Never got a clear likeness, but I got a description once from a man who survived a hold-up outside Telluride. Tall, quiet, scar above the left eyebrow. Rourke's eyes went deliberately to the small, pale scar above Albert's left eyebrow, the one from a horse kick years before Albert had ever met Big Tom Dawson, an old accident that had nothing to do with any of it, though Rourke did not know that and would not have cared if he had. That description could fit half the men in this territory, but it fits you close enough that Mr. Kroll might find it interesting if I mentioned it to him. Might find it interesting enough to write a letter to the marshal's office in Telluride and ask a few questions. Albert set down his tongs, slow and deliberate, and turned to face Rourke fully. "Say what you came to say, Rourke. Mr. Kroll wants the Aldridge lot. He has offered a fair price for it twice and been refused twice. He would take it very kindly if a certain blacksmith stopped putting his back into rebuilding it and stopped putting himself between Mr. Kroll's business and the widow's stubbornness. Do that, and I expect an old bounty description from 5 years back will stay exactly as forgotten as it has been. And if I do not," Rourke smiled, without warmth, "then I expect Mr. Kroll's letter to the marshal's office might jog somebody's memory." Albert stood very still for a long moment, and something in his stillness made even Rourke, hardened as he was, take an unconscious step back toward his horse. "I have spent 3 years in this town," Albert said finally, "trying to be a man worth trusting. I'm not going to stop being that man because you rode in here waving an old poster at me. You tell Kroll he can write whatever letters he likes. I will still be standing at that lot tomorrow morning with a hammer in my hand." Rourke studied him a moment longer, then mounted and rode off without another word, and Albert stood alone at the forge a long time after, watching the coals die down to orange, thinking that he had just gambled everything he had rebuilt on the hope that the man he had become mattered more than the man he had been, and that he had absolutely no way of knowing yet whether that gamble would pay. He did not tell Josephine about the confrontation. He told himself it was to spare her worry in the last weeks before the bakery's reopening, though the truth, had he examined it closely, was that he was afraid of what her face would look like if she learned the whole of what Rourke knew, and he was not yet brave enough to find out. 3 days later, Eli Prescott disappeared. Eli was 18. An orphan the livery owner had taken in 5 years past, quick with horses and quicker with a joke, and he had taken to trailing after Albert Hadley, the way a young man will trail after an older one he admires without quite understanding why, running errands, learning to shoe a horse, asking too many questions about Albert's life before Canyon Ford that Albert always deflected with good humor. On the morning he vanished, the livery was found with a stall door hanging open, a lamp knocked over and its glass shattered on the straw, and Eli's own horse, a piebald mare, gone from her stall along with him. The town's first assumption, and it spread through Canyon Ford like water through a cracked dam, was that Kroll's men had taken the boy, perhaps to send Albert a message plainer than words. Perhaps because Eli had been seen more than once loitering near Kroll's warehouse asking questions he had no business asking. Rourke's visit to the forge 3 nights before had not stayed secret either, for a bounty hunter's business is rarely quiet business, and by the time the sun was fully up over the canyon rim, half the town believed Albert Hadley's past had reached out and swallowed an innocent boy whole. Josephine found Albert at the livery, kneeling in the straw examining the broken lamp glass with a face gone pale and hard. "They took him," she said, not a question. "I do not know that," Albert said, though his voice did not sound certain of the denial. "The stall latch is broken outward, not in. Somebody could have forced it, but there is no blood, no sign of a struggle beyond the lamp, and Eli's rifle is gone from the wall peg too. A man being taken against his will does not usually stop to collect his own rifle. Then where is he? I do not know. But I intend to find out, and I would like you to come with me if you are willing, because 2 sets of eyes read tracks better than one, and because I trust your judgment better than I trust most men's in this town." She did not hesitate. "Let me get my coat and my rifle." They rode out together within the hour, following the piebald mare's tracks north along Canyon Road, before the trail turned unexpectedly toward the ferry landing rather than toward Kroll's warehouse or the bridge, which struck them both as strange, since if Kroll's men had wanted to make a show of taking the boy, the bridge would have made a far more visible route. Old Perkins at the ferry landing, when they found him, chewed his pipe stem a long moment before answering their questions. "Boy came through here 2 nights back near midnight. Alone. Nobody with him, no rope on his wrists, nothing forced about him that I saw. Paid me a dime to cross, which was more than he needed to since I never charge, but he insisted, said he did not want to owe anybody anything on this trip. Asked me the fastest road to Ridgway." Josephine and Albert exchanged a look. "Did he say why?" Albert asked. "Said he had to fetch somebody, would not say who. Looked scared, though, not scared of being chased, scared of being too slow." They rode the Ridgway Road themselves the following morning, an hour before dawn, in air cold enough to frost their horses' breath, warming by midday to a deceptive, golden mildness that made the whole journey feel unreal, as though the canyon itself could not decide what season it wanted to commit to any more than the mystery of Eli's leaving could decide whether it was a kidnapping or something else entirely. They stopped at a way station 8 miles out where the keeper remembered a boy on a piebald mare stopping to water his horse the night before, alone, riding hard, and again, 18 miles further at a second station where the story repeated itself. And by the time they turned their tired horses back toward Canyon Ford that evening, having covered better than 50 miles in one long day without finding the boy himself, only his passing shadow, Albert said what they had both been circling for hours. "He is not taken, Josephine. He left on his own." It was the first time he had called her by her given name, and neither of them remarked on it, though she felt it land somewhere warm beneath her breastbone even through the day's exhaustion and worry. "But why?" she said. "Why would he run off alone toward Ridgway without telling a soul, without even telling you, when he has trailed after you like a shadow for years?" "I do not know," Albert admitted. "But I mean to find out, because whatever reason a boy has for riding 50 miles alone in cold weather without telling his people, it is not a small reason." They returned to Canyon Ford after dark to find the town in an uglier mood than they had left it. Rumor, unchecked, had grown teeth in their absence. Someone, it was never entirely clear who, had suggested that Albert Hadley himself might have sent the boy away, or worse, done away with him quietly, to keep him from talking about whatever Rourke had confronted Albert with at the forge 3 nights before, a confrontation that had, by now, also become common knowledge, embellished with every retelling. Horace Bidwell stood on the mercantile porch as they rode in, and said loudly enough for half the street to hear, "Perhaps the council was right to be cautious about who this town trusts with its children, Mrs. Aldridge, given the company you have taken up rebuilding your lot with." Josephine swung down from her horse with a speed that startled her own mount. "Mr. Bidwell, you will retract that, or you will explain it plainly, one or the other right here. I only say what half this street is already saying. Then half this street is saying something foolish, and I would ask you, of all people, to know better than to repeat a rumor as though it were a fact simply because it is convenient to your existing opinions." Albert stood beside her, saying nothing, letting her fight this particular battle because it was hers to fight, though his jaw was tight enough that Josephine could see the muscle working in the lamplight. It was Reverend Greer who finally stepped between them, raising his hands. "Enough. We have a missing boy and a town eating itself with rumor instead of searching. Mr. Hadley, Mrs. Aldridge, what did you find on the Ridgway Road?" Albert told them plainly, the way stations, the piebald mare, Eli's own insistence on paying the ferry toll though none was required, his stated intention to fetch somebody. "He left of his own will," Albert said. "I do not know why yet. But I would ask this town to hold its judgment until we do know, rather than hanging a man's character on a rumor with no more substance than smoke." It was Perkins, arriving late from the ferry landing with news he had ridden in specially to deliver, who finally cracked the mystery open. "Boy left something behind at my landing," the old waterman said, holding up a small oilcloth-wrapped bundle. "Tucked under a plank when he crossed. My grandson found it fishing this morning. Did not think much of it until I heard the fuss in town." Inside the oilcloth was a torn page from a ledger, in a hand that was not Eli's, listing payments made to a surveyor for a falsified boundary line, moving the ferry landing's legal easement onto private ground Kroll's company had recently purchased, a scheme that would let Kroll close the ferry entirely on legal grounds within the year. And beneath it, in Eli's own rougher hand, a note. "I seen Rourke's men meet the surveyor at the warehouse Tuesday night, and heard them planning to burn the land office record book, so there would be no old deed left to argue against the new survey. I am writing for the deputy marshal at Ridgway because nobody in this town will believe me alone, being just a stable boy, but they will believe a federal man with this ledger page in his hand. Tell Albert I am sorry I did not say goodbye, but I did not want anybody talking me out of it, and I did not want Rourke's men knowing I had this until it was already in the marshal's hands." The room went very quiet. "He did not run from danger," Josephine said slowly. "He ran toward help." "And Kroll knows it," Albert said, his voice suddenly urgent. "If Rourke's men have been watching that landing, they know by now the boy is gone toward Ridgway with evidence. And they know exactly what that evidence would do to Kroll's scheme if it reaches a deputy marshal. Which means Kroll has got maybe 2 days, 3 at the outside, before Eli returns with the law behind him, to destroy anything that could prove the fraud, including that land office record book, including my claim and Josephine's deed inside it." As if summoned by the thought itself, a boy came running down the street at that very moment, breathless, pointing back toward Canyon Road. "Fire!" he gasped. "Up canyon, past the old Hutton mine, and the wind's carrying it down toward town." The uncertain weather that had marked the whole autumn, warm, bright days and hard, freezing nights, had left the canyon brush dry as paper on its south face despite the cold, and a spark from somewhere, whether accident or Kroll's own men covering their tracks by destroying the surveyor's false markers along with everything else, had caught in the dry grass above the mine, and was running now on a rising evening wind straight down the canyon wall toward the cluster of buildings that made up Canyon Ford. Toward the rebuilt bakery with its new oven not yet fired for the first time, toward the livery, the mercantile, the land office with its record book still inside. There was no time left for rumor or suspicion. Albert Hadley looked once at Josephine Aldridge, and she looked back at him, and without a word passing between them, they both understood that whatever had divided the town an hour before did not matter any more, not against a wall of fire coming down the canyon on a dry wind. "The brake line," Albert shouted, already running for the livery. "We cut it at the old irrigation ditch above the schoolhouse rise, same as they did at our Ray in '83. Every hand in this town now, with shovels and wet blankets, or we lose every building we have got standing." What followed was the kind of chaos that only a town used to hardship could turn, within minutes, into something like order. Reverend Greer rang the chapel bell in a pattern everyone in Canyon Ford knew meant trouble beyond a single household's trouble. Horace Bidwell, whatever his failings of imagination regarding widows and schoolrooms, proved himself entirely capable of organizing a bucket line from the river to soak burlap sacks and blankets, and did so without being asked twice. Perkins brought his ferry raft downstream to shuttle water barrels from the deep pool below the landing to a wagon that could haul them up to the brake line faster than any bucket chain alone. Old men who had fought fires in mining camps 20 years before took charge of backfiring a strip of brush below the ditch, burning a deliberate gap the main fire would find nothing to feed on when it reached it. Children too young to dig were set running water buckets between the wells and the wet blanket crews. Josephine organized the women into teams soaking every spare blanket, curtain and canvas tarp in the wells and the horse troughs, dragging them up to the ditch line to be draped over the roofs nearest the rise, her own new bakery roof among them, its shingles still smelling of fresh-cut pine. Albert worked at the ditch itself, widening the old irrigation cut with a dozen other men, deepening it into a proper fire break, his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the cold air, his hands blistering on the shovel handle, and he did not stop, did not think of Rourke or Kroll or the old poster hanging over his head, thought of nothing at all except the width of the ditch and the color of the smoke rolling closer down the canyon wall. Black and orange against a sky gone strange and coppery with the dying light. It was near full dark, the fire close enough now that its heat could be felt on exposed skin 100 yards off, close enough that burning brands were beginning to lift on the updraft and fall like hail beyond the ditch line, that a falling snag of burning pine, weakened at its base, came down without warning across the very section of ditch where Albert was working, pinning his leg beneath a length of burning timber before he could scramble clear, the heat of it already scorching through his boot leather. Josephine, hauling a soaked blanket up from the well not 20 feet away, saw it happen in the space of a single heartbeat, saw Albert go down with a shout that was more surprise than pain, saw the flame licking along the fallen trunk toward where his leg was trapped, and she did not think, did not hesitate, did not wait for one of the men to notice over the roar and shout of the firefight. She dropped the soaked blanket over the burning trunk with her whole weight behind it, smothering the flame where it touched him, and then threw herself down beside the timber and dug her hands beneath it, heedless of the heat still radiating off the wood, and shouted for help in a voice that cut through the noise of the fire itself. 2 men came running, and between the 3 of them they levered the burning log off Albert's leg, and Josephine pulled him clear by the collar of his shirt, dragging him back from the ditch's edge with a strength she did not know she possessed, until the adrenaline of it left her hours later shaking uncontrollably at the memory. "You are burned," she said, tearing his trouser leg open at the shin to look, her hand steady now with the particular calm of someone who has decided panic is a luxury for later. "I have had worse," Albert said, through gritted teeth, which was not strictly true, but he was not about to admit otherwise while she was looking at him like that, fierce and frightened and lovely all at once in the firelight. "You will sit here and let me wrap this, and you will not go back to that ditch tonight," she said, in a tone that brooked no argument, and Albert, despite the pain radiating up his leg, found himself almost smiling at being ordered about so thoroughly by a woman half his size. "Yes, ma'am," he said, the brake held. The backfire ate the brush below the ditch before the main fire reached it, and the fire, finding nothing left to feed on at the ditch line, guttered and turned along the canyon wall instead of coming down into the town, and by 2 in the morning the worst of it had burned itself out against bare rock further up the slope, leaving Canyon Ford standing, singed at its northern edge but whole, every building still upright, the new bakery roof scorched along one corner but sound. They sat together afterward on an overturned water barrel near the well, both of them black with soot, Albert's leg wrapped in strips torn from Josephine's own petticoat, watching the last of the smoke drift pale against a sky beginning, at its eastern edge, to think about dawn. "You saved my leg tonight," Albert said quietly. "Maybe more than my leg. You saved my whole bakery 6 weeks ago," Josephine said. "I would say we are square, Mr. Hadley, except I do not much like the idea of keeping score with you at all." He looked at her then, really looked, soot and exhaustion and the particular rawness that comes after a long fear finally released, and he said, "Josephine, there is something I have not told you, and I think after tonight you have got a right to hear it before this goes any further between us, because I do not want to build anything more with you on ground I have not been honest about." She went very still. "Tell me." So he told her. All of it, the gang, Big Tom Dawson, the robbery outside Telluride, Henry Colby dying at another man's hand, while Albert stood by too frightened and too caught up to stop it. The years of monthly payments to Ruth Colby that had left him with nothing saved when the fire took her bakery, the sale of Ranger, and the tooled saddle to Otis Yancey. Jim Turley's flour arriving at cost because an old debt between outlaws turned honest men still meant something even years later. He told her about Rourke's threat at the forge, about the old poster description that might or might not still fit him closely enough to matter. And he told her, last of all, because it seemed the thing that mattered most, that he had spent every dollar he owned in the world rebuilding her bakery, and had never told her where the flour came from because he had not wanted her bread, of all things, to carry the weight of what he used to be. Josephine listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, the silence stretched long enough that Albert's stomach went tight with a dread worse than any fire. "You sold your horse," she said finally, and her voice was not what he expected, not cold, not shocked, but thick with something closer to tears. "Your saddle, the last things that were truly yours for flour. It seemed a poor trade to weigh against what you had lost." "Albert Hadley," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name either. "You have spent 9 years paying a debt that was never entirely yours to pay alone, and you spent your very last dollar making sure I would have bread to sell before winter, and you did not tell me any of it because you did not want my gratitude to be tangled up with pity for what you used to be. Do you understand that is not a confession that makes me think less of you? It is the opposite entire." "I was afraid it would," Albert admitted. "I have been afraid of that since the day I filed that claim beside your name at Whitcomb's office." "Then you were afraid of the wrong thing," Josephine said, and took his soot-blackened hand in both of hers. "Because I have spent 6 weeks watching you spend everything you have on people who could give you nothing back but bread and company, and I do not need a horse or a saddle or a clean history to know exactly what kind of man that makes you." Neither of them said anything more for a long moment, and neither of them needed to. Eli Prescott rode back into Canyon Ford 2 mornings later, exhausted, saddle sore and triumphant, with Deputy United States Marshal Grant Sutter beside him, a lean, gray-haired man with a federal badge, and a face that suggested he had heard every kind of lie a territory could offer and was rarely surprised anymore by any of them. The ledger page, the fraudulent survey, and Eli's own sworn account of overhearing Rourke's men at the warehouse were enough for Sutter to ride straight for Kroll's office with 2 deputized townsmen at his back rather than wait for further proof. And Kroll, faced with a federal marshal, a ledger in his own surveyor's hand, and a town that had just spent a night fighting a fire his own men's carelessness had likely started while destroying evidence, did not put up much of a fight at all. He was arrested for land fraud and attempted destruction of county records, and Rourke, seeing which way the wind now blew, offered up a fuller confession in exchange for leniency, including the admission that the fire had indeed started from a torch his men had carried up canyon intending to burn survey markers and had lost control of on the dry wind. Marshal Sutter, in the course of untangling the whole affair, asked Albert Hadley directly, in front of half the town gathered at the land office to watch Kroll and Rourke led away in irons, whether there was any truth to the old bounty description Rourke had raised. "There is," Albert said, without flinching, because he had decided somewhere in the ashes of that fire that he was done building his second life on ground he was afraid to stand on plainly. "I rode with Tom Dawson's gang 9 years back, outside Telluride. I was there the night Henry Colby died, though I never fired on him and never fired on any man in that gang's employ. I left within the year, and I have sent money to his widow every month since, and I will answer for whatever the law says I owe for having been there at all." Sutter studied him a long moment, the way a man studies a horse he is deciding whether to trust with a hard trail ahead. "Henry Colby's case was closed 6 years back, Mr. Hadley, when the man who fired the fatal shot, one Thomas Dawson, was hanged in Telluride for a separate killing. There is no live warrant on you that I am aware of, and a man who has spent 9 years quietly paying restitution to a widow he never met face to face is not a man I am inclined to go digging up old ghosts to prosecute, particularly not on the same day he has just helped save an entire town from fire and fraud both. I will make some inquiries to be thorough. I expect they will come back exactly as clean as your recent conduct suggests they ought to. They did 3 weeks later by letter, confirming that no warrant, standing or otherwise, existed against Albert Hadley in any territory, and that Ruth Colby, upon being told by the marshal's office the true source of 9 years of anonymous envelopes, had sent back a short letter of her own, forwarded on to Canyon Ford, which read simply, "I always wondered who sent that money and prayed for them every month, whoever they were. Tell him I forgave whatever debt he thought he owed a long time ago, and that I hope he has found some peace, because Henry would not have wanted a stranger carrying his death around for 9 years like a stone in his boot." Albert read that letter sitting on the front step of Josephine's rebuilt bakery, and he did not try very hard to hide the fact that his eyes were wet when he finished it, and Josephine sat down beside him and did not say anything at all, only took his hand, because some things did not need words laid over them to be understood. The town council met the following week, and this time Josephine was invited, and Horace Bidwell, to his credit, stood up first and moved that the council grant Mrs. Josephine Aldridge a formal license to operate a schoolroom in Canyon Ford, citing her conduct during the fire, her role in exposing Kroll's fraud, and he admitted with visible discomfort his own error in having let old prejudice about widows and propriety cloud his judgment of a woman who had done more for this town's children, and this town's safety, than most men twice her size. The motion passed unanimously, and the back room of the rebuilt bakery, warmed by the very oven flour had been smuggled in for, became, within a month, Canyon Ford's first proper schoolroom, with slates and readers ordered up from Ridgway and 19 children, soon to be 23, filling its benches 5 mornings a week before the bread even finished its first rising. It was on a bright, cold morning in early December, with the last of the aspen leaves long gone and the first real snow dusting the canyon rim, that Albert Hadley walked into that schoolroom during the noon recess, when the children had gone out to eat their lunches in the thin winter sun, and found Josephine alone at her desk, marking sums in a slate with a look of fierce concentration that made him smile before she even noticed him there. "I have got something for you," he said, and set on her desk a small paper-wrapped parcel that was, unmistakably, shaped like a loaf of bread. She raised an eyebrow. "You have brought the baker bread, Mr. Hadley." "That is either very foolish or very funny, and I cannot yet decide which." "Open it," he said, "and you will see it is both." She unwrapped it carefully and found, baked into the crust of what was otherwise an ordinary loaf, a small ring, plain gold, worked loose from the bread with careful fingers, still warm from the oven he had fired that very morning without her knowing. "I asked Mrs. Petrie to bake it for me," Albert admitted, "on account of my own bread coming out flat as a wagon wheel every time I have tried, which you already know, having taught me yourself and given up on the venture entirely." "Albert Hadley," Josephine said, breathless, the ring held loosely between flour-dusted fingers, "I have spent my last dollar once already rebuilding a bakery for a woman who never once asked me where the flour came from, and never once made me feel small for it when she finally learned. I do not have another $85 for a horse and a saddle to sell this time, Josephine. I have got a forge, and a claim filed beside your name at the land office, and whatever is left of a life I am no longer ashamed to offer a person. I would like to spend the rest of it on you, if you will have it, and I promise you this time I will tell you exactly where everything in it came from, every single dollar, for as long as we both live." Josephine laughed, the same startled, delighted laugh he had first heard from her in the ashes of her burned bakery 6 weeks before it became something whole again, and she said, "You baked me a proposal, Albert Hadley, and hid it in bread, when you know perfectly well I would have found it the moment I cut into that loaf for the noon meal regardless." "I was counting on that," Albert said. "I have found that most things worth having in this canyon come to a person through their own kitchen sooner or later. Seemed only right the asking should too." "Yes," she said, before he had even properly finished asking, sliding the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled now for an entirely different reason than fire or fear. "Yes, Albert. And you may tell the whole town, if you like, that the schoolteacher said yes to the blacksmith right in the middle of the noon recess, with flour on both our hands, because I do not intend to spend one more day of my life pretending. I did not fall in love with a man for exactly the reasons everyone in this town once thought made him unsuitable." Outside, the schoolchildren, drawn by some instinct children always seem to have for the exact moment adults wish to be private, had gathered at the schoolroom window and were watching the whole scene unfold with open delight. And when Albert leaned down and kissed Josephine Aldrich soundly in front of her own blackboard, a ragged cheer went up from a dozen small throats outside that could be heard clear down Canyon Road, past the rebuilt bakery, past the toll bridge now under new and honest management, past the free ferry where old Perkins, hearing the commotion drift down the canyon on the cold, bright air, simply nodded to himself as though he had known this particular ending was coming all along, and poled his raft on across the river without missing a stroke. They were married in the schoolroom itself the following spring, once the frost had properly broken, and the canyon walls had gone green again, with the whole town in attendance and Eli Prescott, restored to his place as Albert's shadow, and now formally apprenticed to the forge, standing as best man in a borrowed coat 2 sizes too large for him, grinning the entire way through the ceremony. Josephine kept her bakery and her schoolroom both, running them side by side exactly as she had always intended, and Albert kept his forge, and spent every dollar he earned from that day forward exactly as he had promised, in plain sight, with nothing hidden between them ever again, save perhaps the occasional loaf of bread he still liked to bring her unannounced, just to watch her laugh when she found nothing at all baked inside it but bread, warm and rising and entirely, finally, theirs.